which we'll talk about in a minute as well, which was this sort of notion that when international and local interact, they create something new, whether it's intended or not. It is hybrid, and that generated a bunch of dialogue, and then, yeah, 2014-16, the field sort of washed around, and that's sort of some of the cyclical debate that I'll talk about soon. So, after reading all of these articles, I used a grounded theory approach, so I constructed nodes as I was reading through them, so I didn't approach the discourse with an understanding necessarily of what criticality was. I wanted to see what was being talked about and what wasn't talked about. I made the nodes, and then I decided which ones were sort of critical and which ones weren't. So these are typically things that are considered critical. So critical theorists will talk about, critiquing the international order or the state system or the monopoly of violence and things. So I'm just going to whiz through these today for you so that you can sort of understand where I'm getting some of my arguments from, although I think we've got quite a bit of time. So the first one, the big point to note really is that all of these things were sort of missing. So spoilers, but within the 600 articles, I found that evidence of each of these attributes was relatively lackluster. And by lackluster, I mean like 30 out of 600 articles would sort of engage in the concepts, which to me wasn't really sufficient, but we'll talk about that now. So the first one, critiquing the system or the international order or the structures around us that produce inequality. It's important to critical theorists because if we don't address the underlying causes of inequality and conflict, the more immediate conditions that lead to those conflicts will be reproduced and we'll have conflict again. Now, underlying causes is a phrase that pops up in all peace-building literature. Whether or not you're a problem-solving theorist or a critical theorist doesn't really matter. They're always trying to address the underlying causes. The difference really is that an underlying cause from a critical perspective might be something a wee bit bigger than the post-conflict state that's immediately there. It might be the international economic system, capitalism, it might be environmental factors, it could be any sort of measure, many of them which we'll talk about in more detail in a second, that hasn't been necessarily addressed within sort of problem-solving dynamics and the operations that take place. So looking for those things, 50 articles invoked sort of terms around international structures or systemic factors and sort of critiqued those issues or just showed an awareness of them. 34 actually made concerted efforts to link their critiques to such factors. Now, I'm not talking about factors like pacifism, I'm talking explicitly about the international order here and trying to demonstrate that they needed to challenge that. Big examples for people that are familiar in the field, Mike Pugh, Mark Duffield, Dillian Reed, those people are more sort of meta theorists. They're very, very big picture stuff. They don't really look at peace-building operations as individual issues, which is something that the more problem-solving theorists would do. They looked at, what is the peace-building paradigm and trying to challenge that. Wolf, Goetze, and de Guevara, they write about particular peace-building operations. So Wolf writes a lot about South America, and Goetze writes a lot about Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a few others as well, but they will typically look at a particular instance, a particular peace-building operation, and they'll say, well, in this instance, the economic factors weren't really great. That kept leading to conflict. But we can see that it's not just a problem with the state. Wolf talks about coffee distribution in Bolivia, I think, and says that, well, really what's the bigger problem here isn't coffee production in Bolivia, it's the need for coffee to be exported outside and the detrimental practices of international organizations and things like that are buying that coffee. So that's sort of a critique of the system, or just an allusion to the system, which shows that they're taking into account those factors. Critiques of peace-building objectives, this was a really big one. Essentially every single article that I read, I identified its problematic, what the target of its critique was, where they saw the problem being within peace-building, where the conclusion was addressed to, so what sort of suggestions they gave, and then I made a subjective decision on what its ultimate contribution was. Where was it weighted the most? To what area did it address itself the most? So understandings and concepts, theories, and frameworks are quite similar, though. Understandings is both how we understand and how policymakers and practitioners understand a particular event or a particular occurrence or phenomena. Concepts, theories, and frameworks are sort of the tools that we use to understand those things. As most of you within academia, hopefully you understand what those are. Whereas objectives are sort of the end result. What is peace building trying to produce, which turns out isn't as clear-cut as you would have thought. I would have thought the answer would be peace. But turns out it can be anything from a neoliberal state to a liberal state to the next great place to get oil. Practice is obviously the more sort of smaller implementation. What is this particular operation doing in Sierra Leone around transitional justice? So the breakdown was really that objectives were often ignored. Quite often they would identify the problematic as something that is big. For example, the liberal peace is technically an objective that peace building tries to implement. But then when it came down to it, what they actually address, where their suggestions go, where their conclusions go, what their article is actually focused on is a particular practice. So a particular element of the liberal peace. I didn't give them the benefit of the doubt. I said, no, you're critiquing the practice rather than the objective. Next one, critiques of the state. This was very sort of minimal. And by state, I mean here the concept of the state, the political community that sort of we are part of, and other countries obviously all are as well. I wanted to see whether or not people had sort of been questioning the viability of the state. In a lot of these post-conflict communities, the state was introduced artificially by us during sort of colonial periods. We'd come in, would say, okay, this is a map, this is where you are now part of this country, that is great. And we created all these different clusterings of people and groups of people, and we shifted everyone around, and we've been doing it for hundreds of years beforehand as well. But I wanted to see if people were coming up with alternatives. Within all 600 articles, or 609 articles or whatever, the most common occurrences of state type that came up were weak, failed, or fragile states, which is a significant discourse that we can discuss in more detail in a second. Specific countries, obviously, if you're researching a country, you're going to talk about that. State institutions and the need to sort of transform them, so that could be anything from government or a particular ministry. The liberal state, which is often referred to as a type of state, but often also referred to negatively. Democratic states, generally referred to positively. And then there are sort of alternatives, and there are things like hybrid, post-Westphalian, post-liberal, socialist, Marxist. There are a bunch of different terms that people could use to describe alternative states. None of them were really fleshed out. That was the biggest issue. Basically, the biggest alternative to the state would have been what was called the post-liberal state. It's a type of peace. We can get into that later. It's not actually, there is no structure for a state. The authors that are working on that haven't actually came up with one, but I do discuss that briefly in Imagination soon, and if you've got questions, feel free to ask about it. Critiques of ownership and rights. So I was interested in looking at how we talk about property rights, because a lot of the conflicts are attributed to particular practices of property. So it could be, it could be the environmental effects of an international corporation coming in and buying up a bunch of land and destroying it, which leads to conflict. It could be the way in which elite factions redistribute land to people that support them and take land away from people that don't. All kinds of things which are linked to this liberal notion of ownership and rights. And historically that's been seen as a huge developmental factor. The privatization of land and the allowance of people to be able to actually hold a title to it has progressed the West significantly, apparently, although authors like James C. Scott might contest that. Within the data set, though, people were talking about land ownership and rights, but they're never talking about the sort of underlying principles of those tenets. The problem that was always identified time and time again was with the operationalization of those rights. So the people on the ground didn't have enough land, they couldn't access their farms, wasn't an issue of private property. It was an issue of we haven't given them enough land, we need to redistribute that land. Or economic factors were how people were using that land, not for commercial purposes rather than social purposes. Where I think more sort of fruitful conversations could be had around the fact that and the ways in which this land is privatized and used for specific economic benefit with very little sort of effect or foresight on how that might have knock-on effects for generations, such as like what Aidan's bringing up with his water quality in New Zealand as well, just to drag you into the floor. Critiques of violence was a big one. I didn't really rationalize this one for you. I would have thought, if you're talking about peace building, you're talking about getting rid of violence. Now, one of the biggest definitions of peace is that, well, one of the biggest problems with peace is that it's often defined in opposition to violence, and we don't get much further. So, at the very least, when we think about peace, we think about someone not pointing a gun in our face and shooting us. So I would have thought that talking about non-violence or pacifism and these sorts of things would have been all throughout the literature. But it has been noticed by some scholars, one of whom is in this room, that pacifism is a subjugated sort of discourse and that we don't talk about it. But we don't really talk about non-violence either. So in these articles, 76 articles mentioned the terms 389 times, and those terms were things like legitimacy of violence, monopoly of violence, pacifism, non-violence, and a few more. Most of those references were actually in two texts. One of them had about 180, I think that was yours, Richard, and another one which was on the Pacifist Tea Society in like Wilkinshire in the UK or something, and it was an interesting read. It wasn't really relevant, but that mentioned pacifist a lot, I think primarily just because the organization had it in their title. But most discussions of pacifism or most discussions of non-violence or the legitimacy of violence, which were the only ones that really occurred outside of this, were more about things like disarming rebels or ensuring non-violent resistance to particular things. But it was always this short-term sort of critique. The issue really is, if we go back to state, the Weberian or sort of modern notion of the state is that the state controls a monopoly of violence. That's what it derives its legitimacy from, is its ability to be violent to people within its realm. And, it's allowed to do that because it's sovereign, whereas you're not allowed to exercise violence within the country because you gave up those rights to be part of that country. That's a very poor way of explaining that, right? But there it is. So the issue really is that one of the fundamental notions of our